Would you be willing to say that our national security is so paramount that cuts to the defense budget are unacceptable?
Speaker Gingrich.
No. I helped found the Military Reform Caucus in 1981 at the beginning of the Reagan buildup, because it's clear that there are some things you can do in defense that are less expensive. It's clear if it takes 15 to 20 years to build a weapon system at a time when Apple changes technology every 9 months, there's something profoundly wrong with the system. So I'm not going to tell you automatically I'm going to say yes. But let me make a deeper point, because there's a core thing that's wrong with this whole city. You said earlier that it would take too long to open up American oil. We defeated Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan in 3 years and 8 months because we thought we were serious. If we were serious, we would open up enough oil fields in the next year that the price of oil worldwide would collapse. Now, that's what we'd do if we were a serious country. If we were serious... One last thing. If we were serious, we would apply Strong America Now's model of Lean Six Sigma. We would save $500 billion a year by having an efficient, effective federal government. We would open up federal lands, increasing dramatically both jobs and the amount of revenue to the federal government. There are lots of things you can do if you decide to break out of the current mindless bureaucracy of this city and just get the job done, including, by the way, making the Millennium Challenge work and doing it in a way that we actually help people even more effectively at a much lower cost by having public-private partnerships.
I'm going to bring Governor Huntsman in, but very quickly, Mr. Speaker, would you, if you were President of the United States, bomb Iran's nuclear facilities to prevent it from becoming a nuclear power?
Only as a last recourse and only as a step towards replacing the regime. No bombing campaign which leaves the regime in charge is going to accomplish very much in the long run. You have to seriously talk about regime replacement, not just attacking them. But I will also say, this is, I guess, where I disagree with my good friend Ron Paul. If my choice was to collaborate with the Israelis on a conventional campaign or force them to use their nuclear weapons, it will be an extraordinarily dangerous world if, out of a sense of being abandoned, they went nuclear and used multiple nuclear weapons in Iran. That would be a future none of us would want to live through.
Governor Huntsman, where do you stand on defense cuts?
Well, let's face the economic reality. Let's face the deficit reality we have as a country. We have an economic deficit, and I'd argue that 70% debt to GDP is a national security problem because at some point you just don't grow anymore when your debt becomes that. I mean, look at Japan. They're in their third decade of lost growth. Look at Greece. Look at Italy. So I'd say aside from that, we've got another deficit in this country. It's called the trust deficit. People have lost trust in their institutions of power in America. They don't trust Congress. They don't trust the executive branch. They don't trust Wall Street. The list goes on. We've got to fix both those deficits. But as it relates to defense spending, let's be realistic about this. We can't have an intellectually honest conversation about where we go with debt and spending with sacred cows. Everything's got to be on the table. The Defense Department's got to be on the table, for heaven's sake. But we need to have a Defense Department and a budget for the Defense Department. If we can't find some savings in the $650 billion budget, we're not looking closely enough. But we need spending for the Department of Defense that follows a strategy. And that strategy needs to follow how we best protect the American people now that we're in the second decade of the 21st century. And I believe our national security strategy and our foreign policy increasingly needs to follow, number one, economic policy. It used to break my heart sitting in Beijing, the second largest embassy in the world, looking at neighboring Afghanistan. We'd have 100,000 troops there. The Chinese would move in and take the mining concession. And I say there's something fundamentally wrong with this picture. What are we going to get with the program and determine that foreign policy will be driven by economics? That which plays right back to strengthening our core and creates jobs here on the home front. And second of all, let's face the reality that we have a counterterror threat for as far as the eye can see. Professor Wolfowitz was just up here. I know he's done a lot of work on it. For as far as the eye can see, and that means not only in Afghanistan, but every corner of the world, we've got to prepare for the reality that counterterrorism is here to stay. We need friends and allies who are in this fight with us. We need special forces response capability. We need defense spending that will match the realities of where we find ourselves.
Thank you very much. Let me bring in Governor Perry into this conversation. As you know, the so-called super committee failed. And as a result, unless Congress takes action next year, and an election year, that would be difficult, there's not going to be any change in that automatic trigger, as it's called, that sequestration. $1.2 trillion cut, including $600 billion in defense, will go into effect. Yeah. Here's the question. If you were president of the United States, would you compromise with Democrats in Congress in order to avoid that Washington gridlock that, if you believe the polls, the American people hate?
I don't think anybody is particularly surprised that a super committee failed. It was a super failure, and I think we expected that. We had a president of the United States who is not a leader. He pitched this over to them and said, here, y'all figure this out. I've signed 6 balanced budgets as the head of the state of Texas. I worked with those legislators on a daily basis, or my staff. This president has been an absolute failure when it came to this budget process. And the idea, it was almost reprehensible to me. I've worn the uniform of this country. I've been the commander-in-chief of the 20,000+ National Guard troops that we have in Texas, Dr. Paul. But it was reprehensible for me for this president to stand in front of Americans and to say that $500 billion, $500 million plus, is not going to be on the table, and we're just going to have to work our way through it, putting young men and women's life at jeopardy. And I will tell you, as a commander-in-chief, as an American citizen, that is totally and absolutely irresponsible. Even his own Secretary of Defense said it was irresponsible. As a matter of fact, if Leon Panetta is an honorable man, he should resign and protest.
Here's the question, though. Would you compromise? All of you have said you wouldn't accept any tax increases at all, even if there were 10 times as many spending cuts. So would you just let the gridlock continue, Governor Perry, or would you compromise under those circumstances?
Listen, I've had to work with Democrats for the 10 years that I've been the governor of the state of Texas, so the idea that you can't sit down and work with people on both sides of the aisle, but just to, throw us into that briar patch at this particular point in time and say, what would you do? We would never have gotten into this situation if I were the president of the United States. I'd been there working day in and day out so that we had a budget that not only I've laid out a clear plan to flat tax of 20%, cut the spending, and put a 20% corporate tax rate in. And as a matter of fact, they ought to make the legislature, the Congress, part-time, and that would make as big an impact in this city as anything I can think of.
Let me bring Senator Santorum into this because I covered Ronald Reagan's presidency, and as you know, and I'll read a quote, he wrote in his autobiography this: if you got 75 or 80% of what you were asking for, I say you take it and fight for the rest later. If you got 75 or 80% of what you wanted, would you make a deal with the Democrats, increase some taxes in order to move on and fight the next battle the next day?
It all depends on what the 75 and 85% is. If the things that you have to give up make what you're trying to accomplish harder to do, in other words, reduce the deficit, why the Republicans are drawing a line in the sand, rightfully so, is because what the Democrats are attempting to do is increase taxes, which will slow down this economy, which will increase the deficit, reduce tax revenues ultimately, and increase government payments. So you don't work against yourself. You take ideas from the other side that you may not find particularly valuable, like spending cuts that you may not want. There are spending cuts that I would like to, there are things I mentioned before that I would stand firm on. But in a compromise, yeah, you'd give up some things that you think maybe are critical spending, but you don't undermine the ability of this economy to grow because of politics. This president has poisoned the well. He's campaigned all over this country, trying to divide group from group in order to win, to position himself to win this election, to rally his troops. And what he's done is poisoned the well here in Congress. I've worked together. I've got a long track record of bipartisan accomplishments where I kept to the principles. I use welfare reform as an example. Welfare reform, I stuck to my principles. We cut the welfare budget, we had time limits, we block granted it to the states, and we put a work requirement. Did I compromise on things? Yes, I compromised on some child care, I compromised on some transportation. So I got 75%, but it 100% changed the welfare system because we stuck to our principles.
Let's stay on this subject because I know many of you want to weigh in. We have another question.
My name is Alex Brill, and I'm a research fellow in the economics department at the American Enterprise Institute. Even if the super committee hadn't failed, the savings that they would have proposed would have been a drop in the bucket relative to the $11 trillion deficit our country may face in the subsequent decade. In the decades after that, without entitlement reform will borrow even more. To strengthen our economy, to strengthen our country, what entitlement reform proposals would you make to address our long-term structural deficit?
Good question. Speaker Gingrich.
It's a great question, and it raises the core issue of really large-scale change. Yesterday in Manchester, I outlined a Social Security reform plan based on Chile and based on Galveston, Texas. In Chile, people who have the right to a personal Social Security savings account, for 30 years, the government of Chile has promised that if you don't have as much savings as you would get from Social Security, the government would make up the difference. In 30 years' time, they've paid $0. Even after 07 and 08 and 09, people slid from 3 times as much to 1.5 times as much. But they didn't go below the Social Security amount. The result is in Chile, for example, 72%, they have 72% of the GDP in savings. It has increased the economy, increased the growth of jobs, increased the amount of wealth, and it dramatically solves Social Security without a payment cut and without having to hurt anybody. So I think you can have a series of entitlement reforms that frankly make most of this problem go away without going through the kind of austerity and pain that this city likes.
Let's talk about that, Congresswoman Bachmann. The Social Security, Medicare, health care. What would you cut first? What would you tackle if you were president of the United States?
Well, let me answer that in the context of the super committee, because I was involved in the middle of that fight as a member of Congress this summer, and my voice said this. I said it's time for us to draw a line in the sand. We had sufficient revenues coming in to pay the interest on the debt, but the real issue was, were we going to give Congress another $2.4 billion in borrowing authority? In other words, another blank check to the president. Because again, consider the context. A little over 4 years ago, we were just over $8 trillion in debt. We are now $15 trillion in debt in just over 4 years. Now we're talking about, if the gentleman is correct, adding another $11 trillion in debt over 10 years, or potentially $8.5 trillion, according to the super committee. All that they were asked to do is cut back on $1.2 trillion of that increase in debt. We aren't even talking about the central issue, which is balancing the budget. We need to balance the budget and then chip away at the debt. This isn't monopoly money, because what we need to recognize is that when we are sending interest money over to China, with whom we are highly in hoc, we're not just sending our money, we're sending our power. What will happen is that our national security and our military will decrease, and our money will increase China's military. So think about that. Our money will be used to grow China's military at the expense of the United States military. That should give every American pause.
All right, I want everybody to stand by. I know all of you are going to weigh in. We've got a lot more to discuss, important issues that we're talking about. So collect your thoughts for a moment. More tough questions for the candidates, including their plans for protecting the border, reducing illegal immigration. We're live from Constitution Hall here in Washington, D.C. This is the CNN Republican National Security Debate. Welcome back to the CNN National Security Debate. The next president of the United States will certainly have to tackle conflicts in the Middle East. You're looking at these live pictures coming in from Cairo's Tahrir Square right now in the middle of the night in Egypt. Thousands of Egyptians are again protesting their government as the Arab Spring continues into the winter months. The candidates will weigh in on this and much, much more. We're being seen live around the world right now. Remember, you can send in your questions and comments at cnnpolitics.com. At Twitter, remember, hashtag CNN Debate. The Republican National Security Debate. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the historic Constitution Hall here in Washington, D.C. We're at the CNN Republican National Security Debate. Let's go right to the audience. We have a question. Please give us your name and your organization.
Thank you. My name is Phil Trulock. I'm Executive Vice President, Chief Operating Officer of the Heritage Foundation. And I'd like to thank all the candidates for joining us tonight. No